Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I would like to give you the top 10 armies of October. In this series of videos, I make a list of all the armies that had the most top 5 placings at GT and major events during a certain month. In this case, the month of October. And whatever armies had more placings get higher spots on the list. And if we need it, the tiebreaker that will be used will be the actual placings those lists have achieved. For the purpose of these top 10s, I determine the main faction of each list by which sub-faction had the most points spent on it. So for example, if someone had an Imperium list featuring 1500 points of Blood Angels and 500 points of Astra Militarum, we will consider that list to be a Blood Angels primary faction and Astra Militarum as an ally or secondary faction. And that covers all the exposition you need for this video. So let's get into the top 10 armies of October 2019. Number 10. Adeptus Mechanicus and Tyranids. That's right, we have a tie this month for the 10th place since both armies achieved a single first place finish at a GT or major during the month of October. For the Admech, it looks a little unique from what we're used to seeing out of them. A Mars Battalion and Mars Spearhead with the Styges Battalion. So the Mars stuff is a bunch of long range guns that can castle up with call and a unit of infiltrators. And the Styges Battalion makes use of troops inside of the new Dune Riders. They are cheap transports that will benefit from the -1 to hit that Styges provides, and they can deliver the Skitarii into range pretty easily to get their shots off with their 18-inch assault weapons. And the Dune Riders also come with a decent amount of firepower themselves as well. This style of play actually kinda reminds me of Carey with how they spam transports and Cabal lists. Only downside is that the Admech transports aren't open topped, but they are objectively more durable than the Venoms because they have a higher toughness and double the wounds while still being -1 to hit because of the Styges trait. And they can all benefit from the Styges stratagem that allows you to move units 9 inches before the game even begins. So they can move up 9 inches before the game even begins, and if the situation calls for it, they can hop out all their guys and alpha strike the opponent. So overall, like I said earlier, I think this list is pretty unique and I actually really like it. For the Nids list, it's pretty much a Genestealer Cult list, but because the Nids had a few more points spent on their faction, by this video standards and old ITC standards, they are considered a Tyranid army. The Nids part of the list spams a ton of Gaunts and Zoanthropes. And for the HQs, they have a Neurothrope to provide psychic test rerolls for the Zoanthropes and a Malanthrope that makes everything in the Nids attachment -1 to hit as long as they conga line into the aura. The Zoanthropes, being in units of 4, also get to cast 2 spells instead of 1, which is most likely the reason this player decided to bring 3 units of 4. They are also pretty durable with their 3+ invulnerable save and the -1 to hit from the Malanthrope. And the Gaunts are probably just to screen, deny area, or be a nuisance by tying up enemy units in combat while being fearless through the conga line to the Malanthrope. Number 9. Chaos Knights. The Heretic Titans had 2 top 5 placings during the month of October. The first list is a standard Chaos Knight list that brings 3 Knight Despoilers with double thermal cannons, a flawless host battalion with 3 Disco Lords, and 3 units of cultists as attacks. And an auxiliary support choice of Armon, which to be honest isn't really standard, but personally I think he could be a good choice. Normally a list with 3 Disco Lords tries to fit in a sorcerer of some kind to do warp time and prescience on a Disco Lord. Since prescience will stack with the Disco Lord's natural +1 to hit, meaning those extra hits you get from being flawless host will now trigger on 4+ instead of 6+. And warp time pretty much guarantees that you get a Disco Lord into combat on turn 1 unless the spell fails. So this player opted to bring Ahriman because of his +1 to casting spells, which makes it easier to get those spells off than it would be if they just brought a regular sorcerer. So the idea is that you Zerg rush the enemy with 2 Disco Lords on turn 1, and the other getting +2 to advance from the Soulforged Pack Warlord trait, and using the stratagem to advance and charge to possibly get 2 Disco Lords in the enemy lines on turn 1. Then on turn 2 they are being charged with everything else in the list. It's an elite melee rush list that also has some shooting power with the Knights. As for the second list, it's actually a pure Chaos Knights list, featuring only Chaos Knight units. This list just banks on hoping the enemy doesn't bring enough anti-tank to deal with all these Titanic units before the Titanic units do enough damage to cripple the enemy. Number 8. Adeptus Custodes. The Golden Girls had 2 top 5 placings during the month of October, with their placings being better than Chaos Knights to beat them out in the tiebreaker. The first list is a pure Custodes army and is pretty mech based. It features 2 Palace tanks and 3 Caladius tanks, and the Ares gunship. You stack these units around Trajan for rerolls, and you have a pretty efficient gun line that makes the enemy anti-infantry not very efficient, with the option of having the Ares gunship fly around and possibly drop bombs with its ability, which is probably the best bomb dropping ability I've seen since it can fly over a unit and declare to drop a bomb on it, and you roll a dice for every model in that unit up to a maximum of 20 dice, and on rolls of 4+, it does a mortal wound to that unit. Also, this beast of an aircraft comes with 22 wounds, -1 to hit, and a 5+ invul, making it arguably more durable than a knight since it can only be charged by units with fly and has a built-in -1 to hit. And for the second Custodes list, it's a soup list featuring 2 Caladius, 3 Palace tanks, Trajan and a Vexilla, and then an Admech gunline and an Imperial Knight. It's the same idea for the Custodes stuff in this list as well. Castle up with Trajan and the Vexilla and just try to shoot your opponent off the table with durable vehicles. This player also opted to make his Admech gunline Styges, so essentially the entire army is -1 to hit other than the Knight. I know a while ago some people were saying that after the nerf they received, Caladius tanks weren't going to be that great, but in the current meta that we're in, which is the Space Marine meta, I actually think they are still amazing. They have a good strength and AP, and with their flat 2 damage, they murder Primaris stuff and things like Centurions. And with their -2 to charge them, they negate bonuses that White Scars and Raven Guard can bring to the table. With that said, the Palace tanks have that same ability, so most likely they are used to screen for the other tanks. Number 7. Genestealer Colts. The Scrotum Heads come in number 7 this month with 2 top 5 placings during October, with their placings being better than the Custodes for the tiebreaker. The first list is in a language I cannot read, but it looks like a Tyranid battalion and a Genestealer Cult battalion. As for the second list, it looks pretty standard from what we've seen in the past. A bunch of mining lasers, a big unit of aberrants, rock saw units, a big ham flamer unit to make use of the double shooting combo while deep striking 3 inches away from the enemy, sprinkle in some characters that either buff their own guys or do damage themselves, and yeah, pretty standard for the most part. Still very good though. Number 6. Carey. The host of Whose Line Is It Anyway comes in 6th this month with 3 top 5 placings during the month of October. The lists this time around are pretty Coven and Cabal focused, with only one list opting to take a few witches. First list is mainly Coven stuff using Prophets of Flesh for the increased invulnerable save and access to Irian Rakarth, and a Spearhead and Razorwing of Blackheart to gain access to Agents of Vec, which is the I cancel your stratagem. The staple 3 Ravagers with Disintegrator Cannons with the Archon that has the relic Writ of the Living Muse to reroll 1s to hit and 1s to wound for the Ravagers, and 3 Razorwing Jet Fighters who can, if positioned correctly, also benefit from those rerolls on turn 1. This list spams a lot of 2 damage weapons, which are now what I like to call the Space Marine killers, since they 1-shot Primaris and 2-shot Centurions. Those vehicles will die incredibly easy to stuff like Imperial Fist though, so I feel like this matchup comes down to terrain and movement, and who can kill the enemy's stronger targets first. The second list drops the Airwing detachment and most of the Coven stuff in order to bring more dedicated transports and a lot more infantry, including 3 units of Scourges with Haywire Blasters, which I assume were put in the list to try to help kill the quote-unquote unkillable Leviathan Dreadnought that plagued tournaments in October due to the Iron Hands FAQ not being released until mid-October. And even after the nerf, they are still a decent pickup against mech-based lists. And the third list is more or less the same as the first list, except a few more transports instead of grotesques. Number 5. Tau Empire. Every weeb's favorite army comes in 5th this month with 4 top 5 placings during the month of October. 3 of the 4 lists are essentially Triptide lists like we've been seeing in the past, but the 4th list is a little unique, so we'll save that one for last. I think the Triptide lists are actually incredibly good in today's meta, and well, they have been good in the meta for a while, but I think even more so now that this meta consists of around 25% of the playing field being Space Marines, according to Reese from Frontline Gaming. Their heavy burst cannons are 2 damage weapons with a decently high strength and decently high AP if you upgrade them to have advanced targeting systems. And like I said previously, those kinds of weapons are pretty damn good at murdering Space Marine infantry. And with the combinations of Marker Light bonuses and the Tau Sept stratagem to gain +1 to wound for your whole army against a certain target, this army is pretty decent at killing high toughness vehicles as well. So personally, I think Tau Triptide lists are a good contender for facing off against Marine lists in this meta. As for the 4th list, it only has 2 Triptides but also brings 2 Avara battlesuits, which come with an insanely strong flamer and another insanely strong gun. It's a battlesuit, so drones can eat wounds for it like the Riptides. It has the Nova Reactor ability to gain extra benefits on its weapons, and when it does use the Nova Reactor, its main gun is 3d3 shots at strength 10, -4 AP because of advanced targeting, flat 3 damage, and on all wounds of 6+, they cause d3 mortal wounds to the target in addition to normal damage if the target is a vehicle. This can be combined with the +1 to wound stratagem Tau has to make those mortal wounds happen on a 5+. And its flamer when using the Nova Reactor is 2d6 auto hits, strength 6, -3 AP, and flat 3 damage. Overall, I think Tau is probably one of the better armies in the game for combating current Space Marines, and I think if Tau was a bit more popular, they might have had a higher spot on this month's list. Number 4. Craft Worlds. The Pointy Ears had 4 top 5 placings during the month of October, with their placings being slightly better than the Tau for the tiebreaker. The first list looks like a Sean Naden list, and to be honest, I have little insight on how this list functions, but I assume it's just Hero Hammer where it uses certain units like the Witches to screen for the characters who eventually get into the enemy lines and start punching stuff to death. The second list actually makes use of Inari and Shining Spears, and it looks surprisingly similar to old Inari lists from a year ago. It has a Blackheart detachment with 3 Ravagers and the Writ of the Living Muse combo, Cat Lady with Shining Spears, Dark Reapers, and other Craft World units sprinkled in. As weird as it may be to hear me say this, I was actually kind of starting to miss seeing Inari in these top 10s. The third list features 3 Crimson Hunter Exarchs, which is pretty standard nowadays for Craft Worlds, some Farseers, Rangers for troops, and a unit of 9 Warp Spiders, a big unit of Dark Reapers, 3 Warlocks, and 2 big units of Guardians, which I assume deep strike in and make use of the stratagem to give them a 4+ invul, and then the Psychers to buff them up to make them a bit more durable so they can screen for the characters. And the fourth list is pretty much just a repeat of the second list. And now before we get into the top 3 armies of October, I'd like to take a moment to let you know about the channel's Patreon. Patreon is the main source of income for the channel, and it's what allows me to continue making videos like this. It's a monthly subscription that has different tiers you can sign up for. The first tier is only $5 a month, and it gets you access to the Almost Pro Gaming Discord server where you can chat with myself and other patrons and improve your 40k game. You can get list advice from either myself or other patrons, or just have fun looking at memes. Another tier is the $15 tier, and for that you also get access to the Almost Pro Gaming Discord server, but it also entitles you to a custom list built by myself every month that you remain in that tier. I've had dozens of patrons who have received custom lists by myself go on to win their local events or leagues, and even had a couple of patrons get top 5 at ITC major events with lists that have helped them build and given them advice on. There are multiple tiers to pick from, and they all offer great rewards. So if you wanted to improve your 40k game, or even just join an amazing 40k community of players on Discord, then becoming a patron is a great way to do that while also helping support the channel. I will have a link to the Patreon page in the description of this video in case anyone is interested. And now for the top 3 armies of October. Number 3, Orcs. The Mushroom people had 5 top 5 placings during the month of October. Shock attack guns are still the new hotness for Orcs. Very spammable because of how cheap they are points wise, and they come with some pretty good DACA. Lots of Gretchen to screen and deny area and also act as drones for some of the better units with the stratagem grot shields, while also being a cheap tax to get multiple battalions for those command points. 3 units of 30 boys is a stable frontline to get in there and chop some heads. Strong characters that either smash stuff to death, buff their guys up through auras or spells, or shoot stuff from across the table with shock attack guns. And the Luda Star is still a thing, being able to still make use of the double shooting stratagem and the extra exploding shots combo. Overall, it looks like Orcs are back to being one of the top armies this month, so even though they fell off a bit last month, they're still back in top form. Until chapter approved, when mech guns probably go up in points and Orcs are going to have to figure out something else to do. Number 2, Astra Militarum. The Meat Shield of the Imperium is back in the top 3 this month with 5 top 5 placings during the month of October, with their placings being better than Orcs for the tiebreaker. Only 2 of these lists are Pure Guard, and 3 are technically Imperial Soup or Imperium armies, but those 2 lists do go to show that Mono Guard is still a viable army. I've seen a lot of complaints online from Guard players stating that Guard needs to be buffed in order to compete with Marines, and although I feel that that is kind of the case, to be honest, I feel like every army kind of needs to be buffed to compete with Marines, since with their doctrines and chapter doctrine and 6 pages of stratagems, it makes Marines a little bit overloaded. Guard are still good, and in my opinion still a top tier army, and I'm glad these results are showing it for the most part. Anyways, the first list is Pure Cadian and his 3 battalions. It features Pask, 3 tank commanders, 2 basilisks, 2 wyverns, some mortars, and a ton of infantry. They also include the Emperor's Fist formation and the artillery formation from Vigilus Defiant. Guard is probably the best army for going second in ITC, because they can usually hide most of their stuff on turn 1 to mitigate the Alpha Strike, and then on turn 2 they can pop out and do some damage with their tanks, while also leaving all the artillery to stay still and do damage without needing to see anything. And because of how many infantry they bring, they can easily hold more objectives than their opponent, because they can double move those infantry with the order move, move, move. And getting 10 models with objectives secured on an objective usually means you'll control it. And by going second, they don't have to overextend and grab more objectives than needed to hold more at the end of the battle round. And then especially because their infantry are easily killed, you don't want to go first and overextend and take more objectives than you need, because then those infantry will be easily shot off those objectives before the end of the round. But if you go second, then you can always determine how many objectives you actually need to hold and how many you might need to steal, and you can send out your very fast infantry to go do that. And because your turn ends the battle round, you'll almost always get hold more objectives with a Guard army that has 100 infantry. They also have the option of combining squads to make a super squad and then buff it up with psychic spells, making that giant squad -1 to hit with a 4+ save that can become a 3+ save with the stratagem take cover. Or they can use those spells to protect a unit like Pask. It also has a bunch of indirect fire, which means the enemy can't really hide or camp objectives, and opponents who take engineers as a secondary will often regret it. And now, before we get into the number 1 army of October, let's go over some honorable mentions. These armies had at least 1 top 5 placing during the month of October, but didn't have a first place finish to tie with the Admech and Tyranids for 10th place. So this month we have Harlequins with 1 placing, Deathwatch with 1 placing, Chaos Space Marines with 1 placing, Imperial Knights with 1 placing, Thousand Suns with 1 placing, and Blood Angels with 1 placing. I think it's really funny how fast Imperial Knights have dropped off, and I can only assume it's because a lot of Imperial Knight players switched armies to play the new hotness of Space Marines. As for the Thousand Suns list, I'm sure you guys want to see it, so here it is. It's really just Chaos Soup, but it does make use of Magnus the Red, which I find pretty interesting. I do think Magnus is an incredibly good unit, but I still somewhat feel like he is a liability depending on if you go first or second and the type of deployment that you have, since some armies can easily shoot him off the table before he gets to buff himself up. And now for the best army of October. Number 1. Space Marines. The Games Workshop poster boys had 31 placings. Oh man, I can't fucking do this. This is too much. Games Workshop done fucking broke the game. In all seriousness, Space Marines had 31 placings in the month of October, which doubles the previous record of most top 5 placings we've ever had in a single month during 8th edition. This was the month of Iron Hands, because we went around half of the month with Iron Hands before they were severely nerfed in their supplements FAQ. Iron Hands had 16 of the top 5 placings alone, while other chapters like Raven Guard, White Scars, and Ultramarines each had around 4 top 5 placings, with some successor chapters and other chapters getting a few placements as well. Like I said in the last top 10 video, Iron Hands were literally overpowered. They would bring a character with the Iron Stone, which at the time was an aura and negated 1 damage from all sources on units within 3 inches of that aura. Combine this with the Iron Father, who gave a 5+ invulnerable save to everything with 6 inches, and combine this with the fact that you could heal a vehicle for around 9 wounds each turn, you basically had an army of unkillable vehicles. There was also a strategy to make a bunch of dreadnoughts that have less than 10 wounds into characters, and because they had less than 10 wounds they couldn't be targeted. And then you stick a Leviathan Dread out front that is essentially unkillable without mortal wounds, and even then the Leviathan had an answer for it. So the Leviathan is toughness 8, 4+ invul, 14 wounds. You can make it halve the damage that it takes with the new Dreadnought stratagem from the Space Marine Codex, and then subtract another 1 from that damage for each shot because of the Iron Stone. It would have a 4+ invulnerable save, it could be toughness 9 with a spell, and it had a 6+ feel no pain. So essentially, you could shoot your whole army at it and do about 10 wounds to it. But then the following turn, it gets healed back up to almost full. Meanwhile, you have an army of character dreads behind it that can't be shot at because you can't realistically kill the Leviathan who's out front. So you could try mortal wounds, but then Space Marines have a stratagem to give a vehicle a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, so it would most likely survive that too, especially if they got a little lucky. So then you might be saying, well, why not charge the dreads and just stop them from shooting? Well, Iron Hands have a stratagem that lets them score hits in Overwatch on 4+ instead of 6. And then maybe you can use some Psychic to help kill stuff or debuff it, while Iron Hands have a stratagem to deny a spell on a 4+. On top of that, their chapter doctrine is that when they're in the Devastator doctrine, they don't suffer the penalty to move and shoot heavy weapons, and their heavy weapons reroll hit rolls of 1. So no need for captains to give rerolls, since if your army's spamming heavy weapons, you already get rerolls. And because you start the game in Devastator doctrine, the whole army comes online in turn 1, which also gives an extra -1 AP to all their heavy weapons, meaning when they shoot at the enemy pretty much never gets a save, or at least not a good save. You take Intercessors with Stalker bolt rifles, since they can go off on their own, giving them self rerolls, not suffering a penalty for moving either, and if you need more DACA to deal with hordes, you just go punch them because of all the attacks Primaris get now with Shock Assault. They could also take 3 Storm Talon gunships, and since all of their weapons are heavy, they don't suffer the penalty for moving and shooting. And they have the ability called Strafing Run, which gives them +1 to hit when shooting ground targets, which means all of their heavy weapons hit on 2s and reroll 1s because of their chapter doctrine. This army was honestly pretty nasty, and despite some Iron players complaining about the nerfs, they were honestly justified. Even post-nerf, players like Nick Nanavati got 4th place at the SoCal Open with Iron Hands. He just adjusted his list and made a new list around the nerfs and still performed incredibly well. With those nerfs though, I think Iron Hands might have dropped down to being the 2nd or 3rd best faction from the Space Marines book, but even with that said, all of the Space Marine chapters are incredibly good. So Space Marines in general, they just seem like they're on another level above like every other army in the game, at least currently. With updates from Psychic Awakening and hopefully other armies getting updated codexes in the future, this may change, but for as of right now, Space Marines are probably the best army in the game despite whatever chapter you play from the Space Marine Codex. With that said, I could talk a lot more about this, but this video is already getting close to the 20-minute point, so I would like to cut it here. But I am going to make a video talking about my thoughts on Space Marines and power creep in Warhammer 40k, so if you're interested in hearing me talk about that topic, that video should be up sometime soon. Because it's a video that I'm extremely excited to make, and it's a topic I've wanted to talk about for a while now. Anyways, that's going to be it for this video. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, since it helps out the video with the YouTube algorithm, and also feel free to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that bell icon to be notified when I make new videos in the future. Also, follow me on Facebook and on Twitter. Yes, that's right, I upgraded to 2019 and I now have a Twitter account, so feel free to follow me on either platform. I'll have a link to the Facebook page and the Twitter pages in the description of this video. Also, like I mentioned earlier, check me out on Patreon if you'd like to help support the channel further, or if you'd like to benefit from any of the rewards I offer through Patreon. Thanks to all my patrons for being awesome and helping support me and my channel, and thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Happy wargaming.